The history of the Montana Freemen. According to the FBI, a domestic terrorist organization is defined as a group of individuals associated with a United States based organization that believes in extremist ideas of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature. The Montana Freemen were a domestic terrorist group that rejected the authority of the federal government. They also had extremist ideas regarding race and religion, but expressed a belief that they were Christian and patriotic. Beginning in the mid 1980s, the group's leader, Leroy Schweitzer, a crop duster from Montana and alleged conman, became increasingly frustrated at and angry at what he thought was interference by the government in his life. He refused to get a license to fly his Cessna crop duster, which resulted in federal warrants. He also refused to pay his taxes, which resulted in the IRS seizing his plane, home, and other equipment to pay the $389,000 he owed in back taxes. Thoroughly radicalized in his anti government beliefs, Schweitzer met and partnered with a man by the name of Rodney Skirtle, who shared his anti government beliefs. Skirtle had a history of his own run ins with the government and refused to use a social security number or a driver's license. They were soon joined by Daniel Peterson, another militant who rejected government authority. The three men started the Montana Freemen and set up headquarters at Skirtle's farm outside of Jordan, Montana. During this time, more than a dozen armed men who all had anti-government beliefs and were all tax resistors formed a group and called themselves the Montana Freemen. Collectively, they did not believe in any federal, state, or local laws and felt that organized government was illegitimate and had no rights to perform any official duties. The Freemen defied foreclosures, ignored arrest warrants, and created their own banks so they could defraud the government, financial institutions, and area merchants. Not only were they anti government, but they believed that white Christian men had special citizenship status and that non white, non Christian, and women were second class citizens or worse. For several years, the Freemen caused increasingly trouble for the United States government. They briefly took over a local courthouse and placed bounties of $1 million on government officials to be brought to them dead or alive. They believed that the Freemen were above government prosecution and taxation. Membership in the group increased and they referred to their land as Justice Township and declared they were no longer under the authority of any outside government and believed in individual sovereignty. Local law enforcement, including the sheriff G. Paul Smith, wanted to stop the group, but they were afraid it would turn into violence and bloodshed. No one was sure how far the Freemen would go in their terrorist activities. Sheriff Smith knew that he and his small sheriff's department were outmanned and outgunned. The IRS eventually foreclosed Skirtle's farm for back taxes, but Skirtle and the rest of the Freemen continued to occupy the farm, and it became the headquarters for the organization. The Freemen filed hundreds of phony liens against public officials for billions of dollars. They threatened federal officials and made out fraudulent checks and schemes to defraud the banks. The Freemen were well known for making their own very realistic counterfeit checks and money orders. They would knowingly overpay for items so they could demand refunds. It was reported in 1995 that members wrote a fraudulent check to pay for a purchase of $1.4 million worth of firearms, ammunition, and bulletproof vests. The armed Montana freemen refused to be evicted from the foreclosed farm of Rodney Skirtle in Justice Township. The FBI initiated a sting operation into one of the freemen's financial programs. This led to the arrest of 2 members of the group. After further investigation, the FBI had warrants for 8 other people suspected to be at the farm. Before they were able to arrest them, an armed confrontation developed and the FBI withdrew to avoid further violence. On March 25, 1996, undercover FBI agents were able to lure Schweitzer and 2 other members away from their compound and arrested them. Because of this, approximately 10 armed members of the Montana Freemen began an 81-day standoff, which more than 100 agents from the FBI. Months of patient negotiations paid off. The remaining freemen surrendered peacefully and were subsequently arrested. Because the standoff ended without violence, the government's response to similar conflicts has been to be patient and cautious, even if it draws criticism from the public. U.S. District Judge John Cohenauer, the federal judge in the case of the Montana Freemen, handed down some lengthy prison sentences. They were no longer freemen, but were all going to prison. Leader Leroy Schweitzer received 22 years in prison for 25 convictions ranging from conspiracy, fraud, armed robbery, firearms violations, and bank fraud. He died in federal prison at the age of 73. Daniel Peterson was convicted of 19 of 20 counts and received 15 years in prison. He also received additional time for fraud violations while in prison. Rodney Skirtle received 15 years. Other terrorists involved in this were also given prison sentences up to 15 years. Today, the mindset in Jordan, Montana, where the freemen were based, is that they don't want to talk about it. It was an event that turned out to be very disturbing to many people. Citizens in the area have returned to the business of making a living in an agricultural community. People are more interested in the stock market, commodities, and fuel prices than the Montana freemen. The freemen have moved on, mainly to prison, and many have passed on. The freemen anti-government terrorist beliefs angered the local population because of the bounties placed on the heads of judges and sheriffs with posters that promised rewards, dead or alive. In this small farming community, these people were all friends and relatives. Some local people believe that there are still a few sympathizers with the freemen ideas, so they continue to keep their eyes on things, but don't consider it a huge issue. The current county sheriff says the quickest way to get booted out of a bar here is to start talking about the freemen standoff that turned this remote farming ranching community upside down 10 years ago this spring.